I love me some slow motion. Beyond being incredibly cool, it can be used for story or effect in really useful ways. Recently, Freefly shot over their Ember 5K and 2.5K high-speed cameras, both of which are very impressive, and while definitely not cheap, with the 5K being about $18,000, it's much cheaper to buy, or what most of us would do, rent, than other comparable cameras like the Phantom Vio, which is $60,000. Since I do think that these are amazing cameras, I'm going to say right off the bat that no, Freefly is not a sponsor. They sent me the camera because I requested it and we had to send it back already. But before we get into the camera, let's talk slow motion. Slow motion is one of those filmmaking 101 tools that can go a long way to heighten the story that you're telling if used correctly. In the early days of film, when hand crank cameras were used, slight slow motion was achieved by increasing the speed that the operator cranked the film through the camera. Then once projected while cranking at normal speed, they would get that slight variation of slow motion. Today, we just get to push a button and select our frame rate, and of course, that is how many frames per second that you are capturing. But it's your playback frame rate that decides the slowness of that motion. So for instance, you can record 60 or even 120 frames per second and play it back in that frame rate as well, giving you normal motion that looks terrible, in my opinion. Famous examples of this are the Hobbit film shot at 48 frames per second and Gemini Man shot at 120 frames per second, but mostly presented in 60 frames. For me, this look is a travesty. If you want to see why, check out the clip we put in the notes below. But when you take that same 120 frames per second shot and play it back at 24 frames per second, you get glorious slow motion. With the higher the frame rate, the slower your shot will be. This does bring about some technical issues that you're going to want to keep in mind. The three main issues to be aware of are shutter speed, the light needed, and flicker. For shutter, this is an easy enough fix for most cameras. Instead of operating with the shutter speed and needing to change that manually to match up with your frame rate, set your shutter to angle instead at 180 degrees. Then you'll have the proper shutter regardless of the rate you shift to. For flicker, you'll see that in some of the shots coming up, but some lights will introduce some flicker into your shot as the speed increases. So make sure you do tests ahead of time so you're not surprised after the fact. And finally, the higher the frame rate, the more light that you're going to need to properly expose your shot. This isn't a huge deal until you start getting into the very high frame rates like we did with the Ember. We were shooting over 1000 frames per second, so we basically needed the sun on a C-stand, which we kind of had with our Aperture 1200. But with the Ember all set up, which is possibly the most intuitive camera that I've ever used, they made this thing just brilliantly simple. But for our tests with the Ember, I wanted to get very close to small and fast moments to see how slow motion would alter the very mundane event. Some of the stuff that we shot worked great, some didn't work so much at all, but still looked cool, like these light bulbs. But our first order of business was organizing all our ideas into one place so that we can knock out the shots quickly once I got started. And to do that, we used Milanote, which is today's sponsor. I've been using Milanote for around 4 years now. If you don't know what it is, basically it's a tool for organizing your creative projects. I've been using it for short films, film study, like breaking down different films into acts, building out website flows, set design, and on and on. Most recently, we've been using it for our classic effects episodes, like the last episode we posted. With these episodes, it's all about research and assets, and this can drill down pretty deep, so the ability to organize and compartmentalize is key. Then we can easily find what's interesting about the film and all the assets that we're going to need to tell that story. And that's everything from notes to text, links, tasks, and more, all in one place. I also use it to build out and share mood boards for my projects, whether that's a comic book that I'm writing, a film, or something else. It allows me to build out references here to get my collaborators and I on the same page, which of course you can share these projects and add your collaborators so they can jump in and make changes or leave comments. And if you don't want to start a board from scratch, Milanote has over 100 built-in templates available for every type of creative project, which is easily one of my favorite things here. I do tend to jump between completely different kinds of creative projects: film riot, client work, feature scripts, comics, and the idea of a novel that I've been toying around with for a few years. And here in the templates, you can see that they have templates built specifically for all kinds of jobs. Down here, I can find exactly what I need, and I don't often use templates as is, but it is incredibly helpful to see someone else's structuring of ideas, to either use as a base to start from or for ideas to incorporate into your own process, which you can have document files here too, so I could write a scene idea and leave it organized with the rest if needed. I also use it as a hub for all kinds of concepts that I'm working on, putting things in boards for what I'm actively developing and another base for just ideas. Sometimes it's really helpful to quickly look at all the concepts that you have to choose what direction to go in next. So regardless of what creative project I'm tackling, it's always right inside of here. Best of all, Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so sign up using our link below and get started on your own creative projects. Before we get back into it, let's take a quick tour around this camera. We have both the 5K and the 2.5K here, but I'm just going to focus on the 5K since these two are so similar. As the name suggests, you can shoot up to 5K at 600 frames per second, but you can take that all the way up to 1487 frames per second at 2K, all shooting ProRes 422 LT. We have a Super 35 CMOS sensor here, a global shutter so we don't get any rolling shutter issues, and dynamic range of 11 stops. The 2.5K is pretty much the same all the way around, with the big difference being that it tops out at 2.5K and can shoot all the way up to 3563 frames per second. To do our test, we loaded up with all kinds of colored sand, sparklers, matches, poppers, balloons, and so on. Some was a fail, like this stun gun, which didn't even register on camera, but for a single frame here or there. My favorite shots were from the sand and the sparklers. With the sand, we had two different elements, directly looking at the sand and then bits of particle in the air. Slowed down like this, we're getting a completely different sense of scale and some otherworldly vibes with the particle in the air, some of which reminded me of elements in Oppenheimer. And the sparklers are just mesmerizing. At this speed, you can see the moment it ignites, the bubble right before we get that full reaction. And once we shift to allow the sparks to enter frame, we just get this great design asset for later. Similarly, at this speed, we can see how the match ignites, burning up the match head before it ever gives us any flame. What does this have to do with anything? Nothing, but it's cool. I also took it home to give an attempt at more candid moments in this format, which I did find difficult but fun. You sort of have to think in slow motion. What will this look like after the fact instead of what it's looking like in that moment? And many of them are moments that I had to wait for, like this here. And when you're shooting over 1000 frames per second, that ends up being a massive file. Thankfully, you have 4 terabytes of internal storage here. No cards or external hard drives, all internal, which I did love for the ease of use. Pulling the footage off the camera is pretty simple, either using the app, which we weren't able to do because the latest app isn't out yet and the new firmware for the camera doesn't work with the old app. But it is very simple to connect the camera just like a hard drive and pull the clips from there. As I pulled mine in, I'm using QuickTime to trim the clips to only what I need, but with how slow this all is, some of these clips were still insanely long. Like with the sparklers, one of those shots was 30 minutes long. If we swing back around to the camera's menu, there's not much to talk about here. Like I said before, this is all insanely intuitive. Everything is laid out right there so you can get what you need quickly, like all of your frame rates here, your resolution, playback, which one of the things I love the most is with the playback. You have this scroll wheel here and you can use it to adjust the speed of your playback forward or back. So you can get to the spot you're wanting to watch quickly, and you can also do little speed ramps right inside of the camera using that scroll wheel. We mostly shot everything in 2K since we wanted to go as slow as possible, but even at this low resolution and having to scale up in post, the image looks really solid. Sometimes we're getting some noise due to the low resolution and scaling up, but overall I was shocked at how well this all held together. And I love how accessible this camera is. High-speed slow motion can be an amazing tool in telling your story. Slowing down a moment to its nuanced parts can bring your audience into that moment in a purely emotional way and completely change your relationship to whatever that action is. Great slow motion, for me, reveals the feeling of a moment instead of the reality of it. Oftentimes, an important moment can happen in a blink, but if you're the one experiencing it in real life, it can feel much longer. So for me, the best slow motion inside of any story is purely emotional, allowing the audience to live with that moment longer, see the nuances of the action or emotion of that character. Whether it's dodging a bullet or a character's reaction to something horrific, when used well, it's one of the most effective weapons in the filmmaker arsenal. Again, while this is pricey at $18,000 for the 5K, which is the one that we're using the most here, the closest comparison to that camera is $60,000. But I probably wouldn't buy this. I would look to rent it when I needed it instead. And to rent this, you're looking at around $750 for 4 days. And again, for context, the Phantom is $2,500 for 4 days. So I'm definitely impressed with this tiny camera. Small, non-intrusive size, insanely simple to use, and really solid images. If you're looking for high-speed shots, this is definitely worth a try. But that is it for today. As always, like and subscribe, hit the bell button so you're notified when we put up more content. And until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.
See you later. Ta-ta.